Okay. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our panel discussion about the conclusion priority versus decision priority thinking. We were all just discussing that we probably should have picked a bit of a spicier title for this, but we're glad that you're all here with us nonetheless. I want to just start by emphasizing that our format today is intended to be interactive, flexible, and welcoming. So please feel free to put any questions for our discussion today in the chat at any time. We welcome questions that are at any level. No bad questions here today, and we love a challenge. So we welcome everything. If you would ever like to pose a question verbally, you can also feel free to raise your hand. I'll also just give a little overview of our plan otherwise. We're going to touch on the briefest of introductions to what we mean by conclusion priority and decision priority thinking, super duper brief. And then we have some prepared discussion questions that can touch on the role of both types of thinking in most grant and manuscript writing and areas of active methods development. But again, we want to emphasize that the questions that you might bring today are our priority, so this plan could change actively. So very, very briefly, the question at hand when we think about a conclusion priority perspective and a decision priority perspective is this. Is the goal in question to draw a scientific conclusion, for example, a conclusion that might stand up in what Linda has referred to as science court in various writings, or is the goal to make the best possible decision given the available evidence? These two things can be closely related, so the distinction between them is tricky, which is one of the reasons we're having this discussion today to begin with. But I want to also note that the distinction between these perspectives or these different ways of thinking is not specific to most. I want to highlight this paper from the Decision Sciences from 1999 that we refer to a lot in our discussions of this. This one has a little bit of a spicier title, so we can maybe learn something from that too, that it's The Irrelevance of Inference by Carl Claxton. And one of the points is rather provocatively stated, even in this snip from the abstract, that the rules of inference are arbitrary and entirely irrelevant to the decisions which clinical and economic evaluations claim to inform. One of the points made here is that the activities we might engage in for conclusion purposes, for example, inference and null hypothesis significance testing, might not be so useful for decision making. So with that, I want to turn to our very first question. The question is, what might it look like to use both conclusion and decision priority thinking in selecting an optimized intervention based on the results from an optimization and randomized control trial? And I wonder if I could ask you, Linda, to start us off with your take on this.
Yeah, sure. That's something I've given some thought to over the years I've been working in this area. And one thing that will emerge if a person uses both conclusion and decision priority thinking on the same data set is you might end up with a situation where a particular component doesn't meet the criterion for statistical significance from the conclusion priority perspective, and yet makes it into the intervention. And so, I mean, there's really no reason why the results would look the same if you're looking at things in the conclusion priority versus decision priority perspective. And I know that that's kind of confusing. And when people conduct optimization trials, they want, and I've always written that you could find out both which components should go into the optimized intervention and what works and what doesn't work. But it's interesting how it sounds like those should be the same question, but they're actually subtly different questions. And that it's hard to wrap your mind around that, but I believe that's true.
Yeah. Yeah, I've thought about this as you of course know, Linda, in our latest work in decision making, where we've moved some in the direction of emphasizing a decision based less on inference about main effects and interaction effects and more on the expected outcomes. But one of the things we're thinking about actively is how can you bring those two different types of information together to arrive at the best decision? So you might have information about which combination of components seems to do best, and you also might have information about the main effects of the factors associated with your components. And it seems like the best decision might come from careful, systematic consideration of both of those things.
Well, so I just posed in the chat to our colleagues joining us, what have they done and how have they strategized about these choices and grantsmanship kind of related things. Not to put anybody on the spot, but we've got some OG most enthusiasts on our lineup today, so it would be great to hear how people have thought about this.
If someone has their hand up, we can't see them.
Gabby can.
Yeah, Gabby can. Okay.
Here we go. So I'm moderating the chat. So thank you, Dr. Cleland. Dr. Cleland asks, are there approaches to decision-making that can leverage the efficiencies of factorial design?
So I wonder, and Linda, you can tell me if you have a different take on this question, but I wonder, Chuck, are you referring to the way a factorial design sort of facilitates the estimation of main and interaction effects, and that sort of being the focus, for example, in power analyses and whatnot, versus a comparison among the expected outcomes? Is this sort of what you're thinking about?
Yeah, exactly. Sort of thinking about whole components rather than conditions, and like how might you go about that when you just want to make a decision about the, sort of the best combination intervention.
Yeah, this is a great question, and of course, in the initial approach to decision making that some might be familiar with, that used a component screening approach, where first the main effects and interaction effects that meet a certain predefined threshold for significance are interpreted, and then screening takes place as a function of those interpretations. That was really something that came from the factorial experiment literature, and I think was directly motivated by the understanding of the efficiencies of the factorial design in particular.
And it definitely came from a classical statistics perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Classical inferential statistics.
Right. And that was one of the reasons we were sort of skeptical that decision-making based on expected outcomes would outperform a screening approach, even by a little bit. And it took an extremely rigorous simulation to convince us of that.
Although I think we should say that the component screening approach didn't do badly.
Right.
It
was sort of a non-inferiority question, a little bit.
Yeah.
And they did perform quite similarly. But one thing we've been thinking about lately, Chuck, is whether you can do some of both. One of the best things about a screening approach is that it forces the investigator to really carefully understand main effects and interaction effects that are illuminated by the experimental design. And I think that using those interpretations to better understand the expected outcomes you get is sort of an interesting exercise to envision. But I'll also just acknowledge that it does somewhat go against the trends in the Bayesian decision sciences, which would put a lot of weight on just the expected outcomes. So we find ourselves in this interesting in-between space where we have the factorial traditions on the one hand and the Bayesian decision sciences traditions on the other, and we're kind of charting some rather new territory between the two.
We kind of go back and forth.
Right.
And I think where the component screening approach kind of starts to break down, like the approach I talked about in my book, which my book now sees, well, there's a lot I would like to update in the book, but where the component screening approach really breaks down is when you have more than one outcome, because the results are almost never the same across outcomes. Life just isn't that simple. And so if a component works for one outcome, but doesn't work well, or possibly is even in the minus column for another outcome, what do you do? That opens up, a lot of questions that's really hard to know.
Yeah, and I'll also just say that a screening approach uses the expected outcomes as well eventually, y-hats, once you've identified a screened-in set. And at that point, there are some predicaments about, do you use a parsimonious regression model to estimate those y-hats? That can be sort of a strange thing to do when you're wanting to balance those against cost, just because the prediction might be thrown off some. So the challenges in blending those two sources of information appear in the screening approach, as well as in an approach based on the expected outcomes. He's something I haven't thought too much about before, actually.
So I have a follow-up question, because I get to do this too.
Yeah.
And I don't exactly. It's a working question, right? So just forgive the rough edges here.
Yeah.
But what if you're talking about an implementation outcome, and period, but then also an implementation plus effectiveness outcome? Like, what does talking about those different types of outcomes look like in conclusion versus decision? Do you know what I'm trying to say? Like, is there something here to think through a bit more?
That's a great question. I never thought about it.
I hadn't either.
Me neither. That's why I did it.
One of my very initial reactions is that I could see that it would be possible that there would be types of outcomes where it would be less interesting to people what the null hypothesis significance testing would say. Because when we think about null hypothesis significance testing in science core, we also tend to be thinking about the outcomes on sort of an individual basis that funders care about, that society cares about. And so statistical significance on that outcome means something to people. But when you have something like an implementation outcome, the fact that that's sort of new territory generally perhaps might mean that there's less sort of firm holding to the null hypothesis significance testing perspective, and it might mean that null hypothesis significance testing contributes even less than usual for decision making.
Another thought that's running through my mind is we haven't really talked about non-inferiority. And that comes up, I think, quite a bit in implementation science. And it seems to me that classical hypothesis testing doesn't deal particularly well with questions of non-inferiority. Now, those are tough questions. But I just wonder if a Bayesian approach might deal with them a little bit better.
Yeah, and could be. Well, I think I'll move us on to Second question, Mabel. I've read that using a higher p-value threshold might be justified from a decision priority perspective. How do I sell reviewers on this, especially grant reviewers, though this could be manuscript reviewers as well?
I'll tell you what, in practice, people have done that I've worked with, and I don't think this is good. I'm just going to tell you that this is what people have done, what I've seen people do. And I don't think it's going to work much longer. But what people have done is just go ahead and find a way to power the study at a P of 0.05. And that's what goes in the application. But then when they do the decision-making, they raise the p-value. So just to remind people in the audience, why you might want to raise the p-value. When you raise the p-value, you along with that, you increase statistical power. So because you reduce the type 2 error rate. So when you raise the p-value, you automatically increase the size of the rejection region. And so, that's a way of trying to have a better chance of not overlooking a component that is having an effect. And a lot of times, that would be very costly, overlooking a component that actually has.
So I maybe will just share that I think we've reached a critical mass where folks who are writing grants, especially using most, believe in the decision priority perspective and choose an alpha of 0.1, for example. And they're very worried that reviewers are going to be like, pick up on it or say something bad about it. And, I am prone to hyperbole, but I have never in a summary statement seen a reviewer say anything about a p-value of 0.1 or an alpha, sorry. So
it's more journal article reviewers who are bothered by that.
So I think that's worthwhile noting, right?
I think it's worthwhile noting, but the reason I said a minute ago that I think it won't, that the strategy of going in with a smaller p-value, and then just raising it later, why I think that won't work much longer is up until recently, we hadn't published much about decision-making, and reviewers hadn't even thought about it. They were just kind of grappling with oh my God, this whole thing is from outer space. What, an optimization trial? And so just getting them on board with that was enough. And they were totally, okay, then you're going to use this and the optimization trial is going to show you which components work and which ones don't. I never saw a reviewer go past that and say, wait a minute, it's actually going to be a complicated decision analysis problem, potentially. And so because they never thought about that, it kind of simplified everything from a grant proposal writing point of view. But now that we have some articles out there, and I think there's going to be more, people working in this area, then I think, reviewers are going to expect a more sophisticated approach to decision making. And it might not be the one we have come up with, but I think investigators are going to have thought that through. And so that's going to, I think, throw a spotlight on this conclusion versus this decision priority thing and the selection of a p-value. Now, I don't think that's going to happen right away, but I would say in 5 to 7 years, that's probably going to be an expectation.
So I think that might lead really well into this next question. If I'm using the results of an optimization randomized control trial to identify active ingredients, am I using a conclusion or decision priority perspective? And what does this mean for my power analysis? And one of the reasons I see this as so relevant to what you were just saying, Linda, is that funders do value this activity of trying to identify active ingredients of interventions. And from one perspective, the active ingredients exercise could be considered a conclusion priority exercise where you're saying, I'm coming before scientific court and I'm saying this component is active based on, say, a main effect definition. And if you're wanting to do that and wanting to do decision making, does that mean that the standards for, in terms of p-values might be different?
What do you think, Pete?
I don't know. I'm gonna keep gathering my thoughts for a moment, if that's all right.
I feel like it's like a paradox here in some ways, because on the one hand, we're saying make the best decision about what goes into the optimized intervention. And that decision is going to be based on a number of considerations. It's going to be based on the results of the optimization trial, but not only that, it's going to be based on estimates of resource requirements as well, and on what are the upper limits on those requirements. Mm-hmm. We've also gone around saying, and I don't know how many times I've said this in speaking about MOST, the use of MOST will help us to develop a cumulative base of knowledge about what works and doesn't work. I blithely who said that, many times, but that seems to me to be very much a conclusion priority perspective. So we kind of have, these, we're kind of talking out of those of us working in MOST. I haven't, maybe not you guys, but I have kind of been talking out of both sides of my mouth. I have a conclusion priority side of my mouth and a decision priority side of my mouth. And I know that seems paradoxical and inconsistent, and yet here we are. I mean, I really do believe that both of these perspectives are important, kind of at different points along the process. And so I think an inescapable conclusion is that, and I don't know what to do with this, is that sometimes a component will be in the didn't work category according to the conclusion priority perspective, and there'll be a journal article that says, "Oh, we tested these 5 or 6 components, and A, B, and C worked, and the others didn't." And now you have component E that didn't work. You said in that article, but you included it in the intervention.
Yeah, and that paradox that you just very nicely articulated is where my brain was stuck.
Yep.
When you asked me,
I
do really think that. I mean, of course, I've worked a lot with people who are writing grants, and a big selling feature, one, for getting someone to adopt MOST, but 2, in the grant writing, is the identifying of active components and the contribution that makes to the field.
To science.
Science more broadly. So I think, I don't want to lose that part of what we say and what MOST has to offer, but it's like, which hat's Linda wearing? Conclusion or decision?
Yeah.
Also, it just winds up highlighting a lack of consensus around what it means for a component to be active or what an active ingredient is, because you could define that in terms of having a main effect and say, to be active, a component has to have a main effect of a certain magnitude. Mm-hmm. But then, you'd raise the question of interaction effects. And if a component is active through interaction effects, does that not count? And if you start to say, well, that does count, so you can keep going to an extreme where suddenly you've arrived at the expected outcomes through all of these different effects working together. And so then if you identify the intervention that's best based on the outcomes, maybe everything that's in that intervention should be considered active because it either had a main effect or had enough going on to make it through. And there's no consensus on that.
My inner Linda voice, I hear often, they saying, well, what's your research question? And I actually think that maybe that's framed for this, and that it's okay to have both of these things because you're going to have 2 different research questions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. There's something else I'd like to comment on is that it would be perfectly okay for an investigator to say, I want my intervention to be made up of only components that show a main effect in the analysis of variance of the results from the optimization trial. That would be fine. And in some ways, I hope that eventually that's where we land, because even though this isn't really what I'm recommending to people, because it's a high standard to me, I would like to see us move toward interventions where every component has a main effect. The reason is that it seems to me that people don't always get all the components. And so you want the components to be able to stand alone, so that when people, you want a component not to need to be activated by another, right? For example.
Yes, and I think it's that sort of thinking that might bring us back to the point Chuck made earlier of, an approach to decision-making that makes use of the efficiencies of the factorial experiment. It would be interesting if you could sort of give a little bit more weight to the information that comes from main effects in the decision-making process, or at least in a simple way. If you're looking at expected outcomes and saying this intervention seems to be best, it seems like a critical step to contextualize that in terms of main effects. Is this one that contains 3 different components with main effects? Are there no components with main effects and it's for interactions only?
And that seems unstable to me, potentially. And if it's all interactions, that just seems, I don't know. I'm not, you've certainly seen that, but I'm not super comfortable.
There's also the question of whether there is a real restriction on resources, time, cost, because if you have 2 interventions, one that contains a component that had a strong main effect and another that had that component plus something else, there might be a trade-off there. Do you want to pick the larger intervention, even if it's more costly?
I think I couldn't go up here.
Well, now I just want to share a couple questions from the chat that have come up. So, doctors, is it an oversimplification to say that optimization randomized controlled trials, formerly called screening experiments from a while ago, should default to decision priority because you have the optimization objective in mind, whereas the subsequent trial that would use the evaluation RCT to evaluate a treatment package should default to moving back to conclusion priority?
Yeah, this is, I think it would be fair to say that.
Yeah.
I also will note, though, that the idea of potentially making some conclusions in the optimization phase as well is also something worth thinking about in this sort of, does this component seem to have a main effect kind of a way? And I say that partially from some conversations with people at NIH where there was such emphasis on that as an important insight from the factorial experiment, so that if the sole emphasis is on the decision and the optimization objective, there might be people who miss that.
Yeah, and I do worry about that. I do worry about an overemphasis on a decision priority perspective, and that people won't concern themselves as much with developing a coherent base of knowledge, which I think we really do need, that coherent base of knowledge. The reality is, though, that it's almost always, in fact, I would probably say always the case that to conduct an optimization trial in the way you would need to be able to analyze data from a conclusion priority perspective is more expensive than it is, because if you're approaching things, then it would be from a decision priority perspective, because from a decision priority perspective, you have the option of increasing the type 1 error rate, which means that you need fewer participants to achieve the same level of power. Mm-hmm. And a number of people I've known over the years, that was the only way they could afford to run an optimization trial, was to increase the type 1 error rate. And I feel like that's fine. I mean, I feel like you have to conduct most of the resources that you have available to you, which is another difference between conclusion priority and decision priority. Because with conclusion priority, if you don't have the resources to get a 0.8 power with a 0.05 alpha level, then you don't do the study. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're coming at things from a decision priority perspective, you have to do it. You have to make a decision. And so you work with whatever you have. But you may then end up with results that you can't really look at from a conclusion priority perspective because they've all held up a science court.
Right. Speaking of science court, can the panelists, let me start over. Can the panel talk more about why main effects only would be too high of a standard?
Do you want to feel that?
Yeah. So in practice, the idea that a component is useful only if there's that main effect, the difference between the higher and lower level, averaging across all the other levels of the other factors. The standard that would be the only thing that goes into selecting components. It's in practice, we see fewer main effects than a lot of people anticipate, in the sense that when people are building their optimization randomized control trials, they tend to have a lot of faith in each of the candidate components. But in practice, maybe 1 to 2 to 3, that's starting to get generous, has an observed main effect. At the same time, there can be these synergies that they're involved in, especially when there's a conceptual model that has been built such that there are sort of intricate interrelationships among different mediating constructs, say. So then to say that you need to have that main effect in order to make it into the intervention might be too stringent.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think it's important to realize that if A and B, neither one of them has a main effect, but together they have a synergistic interaction, maybe that synergistic interaction is large enough that you want to include both of those components in the intervention. But now they're not really independent components anymore. If they both have to be present for the effect, then that it seems to me has some should be informative about how you should be conducting the intervention.
Mm-hmm.
David, I've noticed that you unmuted. Did you have a question? Sorry, maybe it's accidental. All right, just don't want to cut anybody off. So next, I'm gonna go to this question. Could you provide an example or two of when a decision might be made to include a component that does not meet a scientific threshold, such as p-value, in an optimized intervention? And what would be the potential thresholds for one to consider in its inclusion?
Yeah, so I'll just point out with this that our latest work in decision making has moved in the direction where you estimate, using all of the involved main and interaction effects using that regression, you estimate a y hat for each of the different combinations of candidate components.
And can I just interject that for those of you who have been with Modes from the very beginning, Jillian is not talking about the parsimonious model. You're talking about a model that has all the effects in it that were estimated, even if they're non-significant.
Right. Yes. So regardless of significance, all of the main and interaction effects, you use those to estimate y hats for each possible version of the intervention. And then the optimized intervention can be the one that performs best on that y hat. So maybe it produces the largest y hat. What that means is that intervention that produces or is associated with the best y hat is likely going to contain any component that has a main effect, but it also might contain components that are part of interactions, and the interactions that they're part of may not meet a p-value threshold that was stated a priori. So they might not be, the interaction effects might not be significant at a p-value of 0.1, but they're contributing information into the decision-making process that suggests they're worth including. So that, from that perspective, it would seem that maybe one or two components that are making it into the intervention are not significant on their own. However, one of the things that we're grappling with and that's come up at various points is, our work suggests that over a large number of trials, the best decision-making happens when you're using that y hat. However, there are more things to think about sometimes. And so Linda's point that in some cases, not all components of an intervention get delivered, that's an extremely important real-world consideration. And so if you're deciding between two interventions that have very similar performance in their y hats, one of them is smaller and contains components with main effects, there might be reason to choose that one legitimately because the y hats are so close to one another. And if you have the larger intervention and the components are dropped from that one, maybe it's the ones with main effects that are key to the other synergies that are dropped. These are things that are more relevant to the considerations of most and less relevant to the sort of considerations that are frequently considered in the Bayesian decision sciences, which is one reason we're feeling a little bit of need to chart some most specific territory in this.
Great. I think we do have one more implementation science focused question, but maybe you do your next question.
Sure. Okay. If I'm approaching the results of an optimization randomized control trial from both perspectives, should I be using two different p-value thresholds? We've touched on this some already. Is there anything else you would want to add here from either of your perspectives?
I think in general you would be, because it seems to me if you're looking at the results of an ORCT from a conclusion, a decision priority perspective, you really want to have as much power as you can. I mean, that's a case where I think you care a bit less about the type 1 error rate. I don't mean you don't care about it, but you would be more open to increasing that in order to increase statistical power. So I think you would, I don't think you arbitrarily have to use two different p-values, but I think most of the time you would want to decision priority. I guess the one exception might be if you had an amazingly huge study where you had such a large N, then you had lots and lots of power, and there wasn't really any need to increase the type 1 error rate. That almost never happened. I'm not saying it's impossible. That would be unusual.
As you were saying this, Linda, I was just continuing to mull over this question of what it means to define the active ingredients or identify the active ingredients. And I was thinking maybe if you're thinking about active ingredients within an intervention package, maybe the standards that we would use to call something active within a package should be different than the standards we would use to evaluate the full package. And what I mean by that is maybe we would want to have a little bit more generosity to the components. Like, we think they're active and we're more likely to give them that chance of being active than to erroneously exclude them.
I think you're making a really good point. And again, I've blithely been going around without thinking about it sufficiently, saying, oh, we need to know what the active ingredients are. But you're right. We need to define active. And as we're sitting here talking about it, I'm wondering whether being active isn't more of a continuum.
Mm-hmm.
And so at one end of it, yes, we know that component is doing nothing. Could even be in the minus. At another end of it, we know the component is having a huge effect, but there's a gray area there in the middle. And so, the more you start to think about this, the more you realize that. And it's just Dave Van Ness haunting me here, but it really comes down to the resource requirements of the component, and is it worth implementing? And so, if it's super active, I'll say, then even if it's pretty expensive, you would want to implement it. But then there's going down the ladder of expense. It's pretty cheap in terms of how much it costs to implement it and how much time it takes for the participants. Then maybe you're willing to toss in something that's like, not super effective, but not doing any harm. It's cheap, so that. Mm-hmm. So So now I'm starting to think that has no meaning. That it being active has no meaning.
And I think that the term active ingredients is not one that you coined.
No, I did not.
And I think it would be interesting to look at the way that other disciplines or fields or entities define
time. That's a really good idea.
I'm thinking specifically, precision medicine uses the term active ingredients. What does that mean? Yeah, maybe. Well, good. Another term that we use differently to the people.
Yeah. That's great though. I think that's a really, really good idea. It's something that we should do. Yeah.
Well, just because I thought of it doesn't mean I have to do it, right? Okay. Can I think related to this question, ask on behalf of Emily Feinberg to go back to the conversation a bit when we talked about the non-inferiority designs. Emily thinks that this is particularly relevant for implementation trials, and when it is necessary to have the comparator or the lower level of a factor be strong. Yes, thoughts?
So the lower level of the factor is strong, and therefore, if you observe a main effect, it really means that your higher level is going far above and beyond. And if you don't observe a main effect, you're mostly observing that there's not a noticeable difference between the levels of these. So it's not, sometimes we can slip into the ease of talking about candidate components and including certain components, excluding other components. But in some cases, we might be looking at a design that's comparing two levels, where the lower level is something really good. And so if the higher level, if that factor doesn't have a significant main effect, it doesn't mean something's not good. It simply means that there's not a statistically significant difference in those two levels.
Yeah, and just to follow on with that thought, usually the higher level is more costly So the question a lot of times isn't so much, is there a difference between them? Although that's important too, but is the difference large enough to warrant the extra cost in the enhanced or higher level?
Yes. And I think that this, and I'm curious to hear what you think about this, but I think this could be a case where using Y-hats for decision making is potentially more meaningful than relying only on main effects and interaction effects, because we could, in theory, have 5 factors that have been set up so that the lower levels are good things. And then that would be evident in the Y-hats, in that those expected outcomes would be good outcomes. And there would be variation in those outcomes as a function of how many different components people received.
So can you have a optimization randomized control trial, an ORCT, that uses a non-inferiority design?
Yes. But we haven't really thought that through.
Right.
But I don't see why you couldn't.
Well, I can't think of one that has. So
Yeah, but I don't see why that couldn't be done.
if someone were to ask me that, I get to be like, well, Linda would say potentially. So that's my answer.
I guess I am saying potentially, but at least on the surface of it, I mean, I've recommended that in theory a number of times. I don't know of an optimization trial that has, seriously had a non-inferiority question in there, but I don't see why it couldn't be done.
If you have, let's say, 5 factors, and you set up the levels such that the lower level of each is a really good thing, then everybody is receiving a bunch of really good things, right? Is one of the risks that you would wind up with not much signal in main effects or interaction effects, and not much signal in Y-hats, if it just turns out to be that there's not a noticeable difference in the levels, but everybody's getting pretty good things.
I wonder if, Emily Feinberg, if you are able, interested, and willing to jump in with your thoughts about this, because I'm even wondering, like, if you had a thought about using a non-inferiority design with an optimization trial, like, hi, by the way, hello.
So I'm not thinking about it, but I'm thinking about the fact that in the trial that we're doing, I feel like for better or for worse, but I think that's what we're going to be faced with, that the sort of base intervention, so the lower level of all of our components, are going to be okay. And so in sense, some of the higher levels of the component do require more resources and time to implement. So, maybe we just conceptualized this wrong, which is certainly very possible when we first started. And there are some things that are in sort of the base intervention that we're not manipulating, we should have. But I'm just trying to think, if you're in a situation where a site might say, no, you can't do this, or we don't want to do this unless you do this for everyone at a minimum, then you are in that situation where maybe a non-inferiority trial is the way to go.
Yeah. I think this would be really interesting to think about and kind of play through, and even how I know the example you're giving makes really good sense, but from pitching an idea and grant writing this idea, I think it would be a really fun exercise to try to see how that went. I don't know, Emily, let's do that next.
Well, there may be like a situation where there's a real debate in the field whether a certain, sort of, one of the sort of higher level of the component has a certain amount of popularity, but people think, well, is it really worth it? And in that case, then to sort of settle it within the field, a non-inferiority trial may be the way to go.
Well, yeah, and all the considerations that apply in evaluation RCTs, when it's a non-inferiority trial, would apply here too. And you have to kind of really double down on statistical power in non-inferiority trials.
Well, thanks for sharing your idea, Emily. Thanks. I just want to call attention to our time. So if there was anybody else who had a burning question or wanted input on a proposal they're working on, a paper they're framing, this would be a great time.
And as we let people think about that, I'll also turn to one last question here on whether we can comment on whether cost effectiveness analysis involves conclusion or decision priority thinking. And I think one of the themes of our discussion today has sort of been how messy all of this is. And the mess extends to cost effectiveness analysis too.
How messy all of this is and how much we need really precise definitions.
Yes. Because cost effectiveness analysis is typically talked about as a tool for decision. But of course, it can take many different forms, mean many different things. It can be done really well. It can be done really poorly. But if we're thinking just sort of the gold standard cost effectiveness analysis, that, from my perspective, tends to involve more conclusion priority thinking than decision priority thinking. And one of the reasons for that is just the stakes involved, where you're using a cost effectiveness analysis to rigorously compare a few interventions, including maybe the one that's being given currently. And you're trying to motivate the reallocation of resources away from what's being done currently to something new. And so that's a very sort of societal question, thus the need to specify a perspective and cost effectiveness and whatnot. So even though there's a decision involved, the level of rigor sort of requires that scientific conclusion to hold before the decision is made. In our work, we have advanced some strategies for balancing cost that are not necessarily considered cost effectiveness proper, but sort of cousins of cost effectiveness analysis maybe, that takes on more squarely the decision priority thinking, where you have a number of alternative versions of an intervention consisting of different components or component levels, and you have to pick one to move forward with. And so from a decision priority sense, how can you make the best use of the available evidence for effectiveness and also bring in cost? What do you think about this, either you panelists?
I find myself more often than not pushing back on, consulting that I do with cost effectiveness. Because from my opinion and my perspective, is cost effectiveness is more of a conclusive kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't thought, I don't know, I've been kind of pushing folks away from doing that because I don't think we're right.
Yeah, there are times where we realize we have to be really clear, not just in defining things like active ingredients, but just what even do we mean by effectiveness and what has been estimated in a factorial trial. And a lot of times when people talk about effectiveness, they mean a treatment control difference. And that can be the sort of effectiveness information that gets brought into a cost effectiveness analysis. But that's not what we tend to have based on the results of an optimization trial, once maybe that's what we have. So with that in mind, the sort of information that we're balancing on the effectiveness side of things is different.
So some people are probably thinking, well, if they don't have effectiveness based on an optimization trial, what the heck do they have? And I would say there are different ways to look at effectiveness. We're as intervention scientists, we're accustomed to thinking of it as a treatment control difference. But the way you think about it in optimization is more, as Jillian was saying, as the Y hat associated with each combination of components or each experimental condition in the analysis of variance. So that those are two, I think, valid but very different ways of thinking about conceptualizing the idea of intervention effectiveness. And I think the former lends itself perhaps more to a traditional cost effectiveness analysis involving qualities and all that, and a whole bunch of like downstream considerations. And what the kind of costs we tend to think about in decision making with the approaches that Jillian has been working on, we use the Y hat more. And the kinds of costs we use are more implementation costs, not downstream costs, like how many more days, how many fewer days per year is a person off work, or how much less do they cost the healthcare system, or something like that.
Right. So, do you have the last slide? No, that's okay. We can the last. The last one. I don't have it. So, as we just shared the last slide, I'm gonna share that Shelley asked a question about how it's very difficult in published papers to know what somebody is adopting in terms of their decision or conclusion perspective. And what are we thinking about, or is there any movement towards better documentation and kind of outlining those things? And I will just share that this is something that Angela Famatter and I have talked about quite a bit. There's a paper that Ryan Landau led that has a checklist for preparation phase activities, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to expand that into the bigger, most framework and checklist. So I like where you're going. Okay. Well, this has been lots of fun for me, at least. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us in this discussion today. Our next webinar will be November 15th with Dr. Ellen Fitzsimmons-Kraft. And we also have applications open for our next training in January this next year. And just while there are a few senior folks on the call, the next couple trainings are targeted specifically towards early career investigators. And so please let us know if we can share with your mentoring teams or networks in a different way. Okay, and
thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.